What's up, everyone? We are diving back into the multiverse today for another epic. What if Naruto became Dragon Champion and built ultimate harem with Anko X, Kurenai X Ayame xTemari, and Tenten Part 5? If you enjoy this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more fanfics like this. Now, let's dive right into the fanfic. The Jonin groaned mentally at the way Kalen spoke to him as he continued to push deeper into her vagina. The wetness, tightness, heat, and softness was enough to make him feel like his COC was going to melt right off at this moment. He managed to control his urges as he pressed deeper into her vagina. He had expected that there would be some semblance of a virginal barrier in Kalen but found none. He smiled as he decided to do what Kalen wanted as he thrust deeply into her with all the speed he could get into himself without hurting her the slightest. It was not long before his full length and width was deep in her vagina. Yes. Kalen cried out as she felt Kakashi's COC fill her vagina to the brim as he pushed himself deeper into her vagina. The feeling of her lover's COC in her was more than enough to make the normally disciplined war blade become like a woman in pure ecstasy, and that was proven as she felt Kakashi's COC fill her deeply. As soon as he was deep inside of her, she then felt her whole frame shudder in pleasure and wetness as she knew that he had just brought her to orgasm in that moment. Kami. Kakashi swore as he gritted his teeth to try and hold himself back as he felt Kalen's vagina begin to milk him for all he was worth, and it took all of his self-control to keep himself from orgasm as well. He wanted this to last a heck of a lot longer, and that was why he did his absolute best to hold it in. He succeeds and looked at Kalen, who was a satisfied smile on her face as she reached out and made him kiss her deeply. The two then parted as Kalen looked at Kakashi hotly, making him feel even more aroused as the sight of the redhead this way. Kakashi. Now, please. Kakashi nodded as he began to move, doing so slowly to make sure that he got it right. He could see the results of his actions on Kalen as she moaned out and gripped his arms with her hands tightly. As if not wanting to lose the feel of him in her arms, as soon as he was nearly out of her vagina, he pushed right back in, making her shake her head a bit and making several moaning and mewling sounds, that in the sight of her blush growing to match the color of her hair, her eyes becoming emerald pools filled with passion that bore into him, and the feel of her vaginal walls milking his COC was more than enough to arouse Kakashi as he carried on, slowly repeating the process of pulling out and then sliding back in. More. Kakashi. Kalen was in heaven as she crossed her legs behind Kakashi's behind and used her legs to push on him to make sure that his COC was going deeply into her with each of his thrusts into her vagina. She wanted this, and now she was relishing each moment of it all. She was beautiful as Kakashi looked at her once more. Her form was perfectly shaped and formed, possessing the form, build and strength of a battle-hardened woman, but having the curves and swells that a woman in full bloom should have. Her red hair was there like red silk, and her eyes were like emerald pools that burned deeply in desire, passion, and affection for him. Her breast moved with her body as he continued to thrust his COC in and out of her vagina. Her womanhood was dripping out her juices with each thrust of his COC into her, and the sight of it was wonderful. The Jonin sped up until he was moving at great speed and power, much to his lover's joy and desire as she continued to push him on with her cries. He was thankful that he had personally soundproofed his home. Back then he had done this out of a blind fit of anger due to his father Tsukumo Hataki's actions long ago, but after Obito's death and seeing the same reason why his father chose his friends over the mission, he decided to leave the soundproofing there, to remind him of the past. Now in this case, he was happy that he left it there so no one would hear this. The last thing he wanted was a bunch of Anbu or other ninja barging in. He would never forgive himself if that happened, and he had no doubt Kalen would be less that pleased. He put that out of his mind as he carried on. Yes. Harder. Deeper. Kalen. You feel so hot. Harder. Kakashi. You feel so good. The two lovers were going at it at full tilt. Kakashi lavished kisses and licks on Kalen's breast as well as kissing her deeply, while Kalen responded in kind while pulling Kakashi down to lick his face, lips and tongue along with running her hands on his body. It was not going to be long before the two of them finally would hit their limits, and they did at the very same moment. Kakashi felt his COC unleash another thick stream of his cum into Kalen's vagina as he felt her own orgasm that further enhanced his own as he felt the juices she released in her orgasm flood over his COC and mixed with his own juices. He felt her inner walls move, and the feel of it all as they caressed his COC was something that was driving the white-haired Jonin to the very limits of his self-control as he thrust his COC in a few more times to give both Kaylin and himself more pleasure. Kaylin herself was also in awe at the pleasure that hit her body as she felt her lover's cum flood her vagina to the very brim. The thickness, wetness, and heat from her lover's seed made her orgasm a bit more times, and she loved the pleasure that came as a result of it. She knew that she was not fertile at the moment, so there was no risk of them having a baby as of yet, but she didn't mind. There was plenty of time for such things later on in life. As Kakashi lay on the bed with Kaylin on top of him at the moment, he ran his hands on her back, making the war blade moan out a bit, and she turned to face him, a smile of passion and happiness on her face, making the Jonin even more aware of how attractive she was. Kakashi looked at her once more as she moved up to look him over as well. He didn't stop her at all as she ran her hands on his body and she spoke to him. "That was wonderful, Kakashi. You've done this before." In that moment, Kakashi blushed and shook his head, making Kaylin smile somewhat at the sight of that blush, as she was quick to get the meaning behind the blush that stained the Jonin's face. Kakashi sighed and shook his head. This was true, as he had done this before to get information in his time as a ninja. He expecting Kaylin to be unhappy with him, but it seemed that she was not the least bit offended by that as she rubbed her breast on his chest and kissed him hard on the lips, and she replied, "I'm not offended, you know. I expected that from your line of work. But I do have a surprise for you. Here's something for you to think about. Even though I didn't have a barrier there, I'm a virgin." Kakashi's eye widened at that as he couldn't believe that she had just told him that she herself was a virgin. He thought she was just joking, but seeing the way she looked at him when she said it, and remembering how wonderful and natural her actions were, told him otherwise. As a ninja, he had been trained to tell when someone was being deceptive, and Kaylin's moans and cries as well were all natural, proving that she is, or rather was indeed, a full-fledged virgin despite the fact that she had no virginal barrier to speak of, and now he had made her into a full woman. That was enough to make Kakashi feel like he was going to faint. Kaylin somehow noted that and gently controlled her inner muscles in her body, namely in her crotch, and that was enough to make her vaginal walls caress Kakashi's COC gently, making the Jonin gasp in pleasure and surprise as she spoke to him in a teasing way. "Don't you dare faint on me yet, Kakashi. There is so much time left before morning, and I am eager to see if you have what it takes to make all those moves in those books you love reading." Kakashi was surprised by that and looked at Kaylin and spoke to her seriously. "Are you serious, Kaylin? You want to do all that?" Kaylin purred a bit into Kakashi's ear, licking the inner whorls of the Jonin's ear and then nibbling his earlobe gently as she spoke. "Of course, come on, Kakashi, let's make this night one to remember." In that moment, Kakashi smiled and decided to do so, and Kaylin was more than willing and eager as the Jonin moved, and now he was on top of her. He leaned down and pleasured her breast once more, making her cry out in pleasure as well as eagerness for more. Kakashi was more than willing to go ahead and do what he had to in order to see Kaylin in the throes of orgasm, as well as hear her cry out his name in utter pleasure. He started doing so as he began to move his COC in and out of her vagina once more. That desire he had in his brain was enough to get the red-haired war blade to cry out in pleasurable surprise. "Ah, Kakashi, feels good." Kaylin wrapped her legs around Kakashi as she caressed his face with her hands, as the two of them were now going to drive each other to the limit. She had always heard this kind of talk between the women who were not soldiers when they talked about their mates, or with her fellow female warriors who were with their lovers or husbands. She had heard plenty of that, but she wanted to experience that herself, and now that she was not going to forget this anytime soon. Kakashi was more than willing to do what he always wanted to do in the stories he had been able to read in the Ika Ika books, and since she was more than eager to do all that with him, he was more than ready to go full throttle. Yes. Harder. Kaylin cried out as she was on her hands and knees on Kakashi's bed, as the white-haired Jonin was behind her on his own knees and his hands on her hips as he continued to move his hips back and forth with his COC deep in her vagina as they were moving like wild animals in rhythm with one another. She didn't mind in the least, as this position made her feel even more pleasure build in her body, as each thrust of Kakashi's COC in her vagina was more than enough to make her cry out. Kakashi himself gritted his teeth as this position gave him a new amount of pleasure as he continued to move his COC in and out of Kalen's vagina with each thrust of his hips, and it was in a different angle as well, which was why he felt this much pleasure. He was also amazed at how much Kalen seemed to enjoy this position as well, and that was more than enough to convince him to keep this position in mind. He then reached with his hands to Kalen's breasts, feeling them in his hands and massaging them the way he realized she liked them to massaged. He also played gently with her nipples in this position, and he leaned forward as she turned to face him. The two of them kissed one another deeply as Kakashi continued with his thrusts into her vagina. The kiss lasted for a long while until the two parted from one another to get some much needed air into their bodies. It was not long before the two of them finally reached their own limits as they both came at the same time. Yes. Both lovers panted as they managed to not fall on one another as they lay gently on either side. Their orgasm was delicious to them as both could feel each other's release. Kakashi, however, was not going to let the night end like that now of all things. Yes. More. Kalen cried out once more in pleasure as she lay on her side as Kakashi held one of her legs to his shoulder while her other leg was underneath the joint as he continued to thrust deeply into her vagina while he was playing with her clitoris with his free hand along with licking her thigh with his tongue. The pleasure that she was feeling was more than worth this somewhat odd position that she and Kakashi were attempting at this point in time. Kakashi himself was already reaching his limits as he continued to thrust in hard and deep as best he could, but thankfully his previous orgasms had helped him develop some more control as he could keep on going for longer in pleasuring both Kalen and himself, and the war blade was more than willing to go ahead with the flow that they were not part of. The Jonin felt each bolt of pleasure run up and down his body and could see the very same thing in Kalen's face as well. They carried on as Kalen allowed Kakashi to play with her breasts as she then took his hand and licked his fingers in a very erotic fashion and gently bit them as well, making the Jonin hiss a bit pleasurable surprise. The war blade soused on them gently and deeply until she felt her body reach her limits. The same was true for Kakashi as he finally reached his own limit as he thrust deeply once more into Kalen's vagina. Kakashi stayed there as he felt his COC fire more of his cum into Kalen's vagina as she too moaned out deeply as she felt her vagina being filled to the brim once more by her lover's own essence. It made them both moan out loud gently as they stayed in that position for a bit longer. As soon as they felt their orgasms subside, Kakashi moved away from Kalen while placing down Kalen's leg. He lay down on the bed and tried to gather his breath, and turned to face the tired war blade. But he was not going to get far as Kalen smiled seductively at him and moved to straddle his hips, and he knew that he was not getting out scot-free just yet, not that he had a problem with that of course. Kakashi. Kalen moaned out as she was now on top of Kakashi as she moved her hips up and down on Kakashi's COC as she impaled herself on her lover's COC, and she could see that her actions was more than welcomed by her lover as he reached out and played with her breasts with his hands. She moaned out her pleasure with each rise and fall of her hips. This angle allowed Kakashi's COC to go even deeper into her vagina as well as touch a certain spot in her vagina that seemed to triple the amount of pleasure that she was feeling. Kakashi himself was more than willing to let Kalen have her way with him as this allowed him to get some much needed rest for his back, as despite his reluctance to admit it he was feeling rather tired, and this was going to help his body relax a bit, though with what Kalen was doing to him along with the fact that he was able to see the woman this way was more than a bonus. To see a green-eyed and blood-red-haired goddess who was naked on top of him with her hair acting like red silk moving with each thrust of her hips, her breasts moving in sync with her actions, her face flushed red with pleasure, her naked body covered in sweat, the smell of SX thick in the air, and the sight of with his COC being engulfed by her vagina with each descent of her body was more than enough to convince the Jonin to stay right where he was at this point of time. He could already see that she was reaching her limit, but her own battle-hardened and trained endurance had held her up this far as she continued to move her body up and down while he played with her breasts with his hands. He was enjoying this sight before him immensely and hoped that he was going to remember this for a very long time. It was not long before Kalen leaned forwards, allowing her breasts to be closer to him, and he wasted no time responding to the wordless desire of the red-haired woman as he licked and soused on her breasts, making her moan even louder as she continued to move her hips on his COC, and on the last thrust he released her breasts from his mouth as they both screamed their release. Yes. Kaylin shivered as she felt herself being filled to the brim once more by her lover's cum while Kakashi felt Kaylin's inner walls milk him for all he was worth, and it was undeniably something that he was going to enjoy for a very long time. The redhead then kissed him deeply while moving her hips a bit more to get all the delicious sensations that flooded her body. As soon as that was over, the redhead lay down on her lover with deep breaths as she tried to get her breath back. The two looked at one another as Kakashi looked at Kaylin's deep green eyes as well as her beautiful face, marveling at the way she looked at him with the look of passion there in her eyes and face as well the twin splashes of red that was equaling the very same color of her hair. Kaylin smiled and whispered to him in an undeniably seductive voice. I wish we could continue, but I am tired. I know, so am I. I guess we can take a break. Kaylin grinned a bit as she kissed him gently but with the very same passion that she displayed when they started doing this hours before. Kakashi naturally replied with the very same passion. Both lovers were now on their bed and were sleeping snuggly with their arms around one another as sleep claimed the two of them. To be continued. Author's notes. Now this is something hot, a 2-for-1 special, saves up on document work and certainly saves me a whole mess of headaches as well. Anyhow, I hope this was fine for all my readers of the Naruto Dragon Champion storyboard because this one had been a real test for me as well since this was a good idea to boot. By the way, if Kakashi and Kaylin continue with this while Naruto is away, then for all we know, in the future installment of Naruto Dragon Champion, Kakashi and Kaylin might become parents. Food for thought, huh? Anyhow, we'll be moving on to the other end sections soon enough and it will not be long before we tackle the ones with Tenten and Shizune. Those will certainly be interesting to say the very least and will be a hot number to boot for all involved as Shizune and Tenten now get to have Naruto all to themselves soon enough. Hang on and prepare for that. Shizune and Naruto. The two kissed one another deeply as they felt one another grow even hotter with the deep kiss that they were now giving one another. The Jonin felt her body grow hotter by the second as she allowed Naruto to kiss her deeply as he began to reach out to her body to pleasure her with his hands, and sure enough, the very second he caressed her body through her parted kimono, she moaned out her pleasure. Naruto grinned mentally at that as he could tell that Shizune loved that kind of pleasure flowing through her body as he continued to move his hands slowly over the Jonin's naked form as he then moved away her kimono, allowing the clothing to fall off Shizune's form, allowing him to see her in her full naked glory. He and Shizune parted from the kiss as he looked at her once more. The Jonin might not have the same build as her sensei and some of the other women, but he saw the beauty that she had in her form. You look beautiful, Shizune-chan. Naruto-kun. Shizune blushed a bit more at the way Naruto took in her naked form hungrily with his eyes. She then decided to return the favor as she began to remove his own clothes, doing things slowly so as to enjoy the sight of his soon-to-be naked form. Naruto was more than willing to indulge her desires as he didn't resist, allowing her to do the disrobing of his form in her own pace. And it seemed that Shizune was more than happy to take her time with disrobing her lover as she took her time as well as kissing the parts of him that were not exposed. She started with his shoulders as she took off his upper clothing, then made her way to his chest, licking and kissing his chest as well as his nipples. The blonde Chunin and Dragon Champion moaned a bit at the pleasure while he gave back the same pleasure as he used his chakra to touch the nerve areas of the Jonin's body, namely the pleasure areas of her nerves to make her feel even better. Shizune moaned her approval of Naruto's actions on her body as they also rubbed their bodies on one another. Shizune moaned a bit as she felt the heat of Naruto's body on her own body and she could tell that Naruto loved the feel of her soft and supple female form on his own body. Naruto then moved to the nearby wall and as soon as they were there, he began to kiss Shizune deeply while moving his coc there between her thighs. He then felt her vagina which was already wet as some of her juices were already covering his coc. He then moved his hips and in turn his coc began to rub Shizune's vaginal lips and her clitoris as well, making the Jonin moan out in pleasure at her lover's actions. Yes, Naruto-kun. Naruto then moved to face Shizune as he licked her cheek and the Jonin moved to take in his tongue into her own mouth and suck on it deeply, making the two of them even more aroused and eager for one another. As they parted, the Jonin panted out as she felt her lover's coc continuing to move over her vaginal lips as well as her clitoris. The actions of the blonde Chunin were totally delicious in her mind and she vowed to make sure that she gave him the very same pleasure while they continued to kiss one another. The blonde Chunin marveled the feel of his lover's breast on his body, and he could already feel the hardness of her now aroused nipples. The blonde Chunin continued to pleasure the Jonin-ranked medic Nin with his COC as he moved his hips and in turn rubbed his COC on her vagina and her clitoris. The results of his actions were obvious as Shizune was panting out in pleasure, she was blushing, breathing slowly in gasps, and her body was becoming covered by sweat. Naruto saw that and he began to lick, nip and kiss Shizune's neck, her shoulders and collar bones, while moving back a bit and allowing his hands to massage and play with her breasts as well as her nipples. Naruto-kun, just like that. Shizune was enjoying this as she felt her lover's COC on her vagina and her clitoris along with feeling his hands massaging her breasts and nipples just the way she wanted. This sent new waves of pleasure throughout her body. She then decided to use her own free hands as she summoned her chakra once more to focus on her fingers and the palms of their hands. She then ran her hands on his back, shoulders, and his buttocks, making sure to aim at the blonde Chunin's pleasure centers to make him feel even more aroused by the second. Her actions were well rewarded as Naruto moaned out deeply in front of her. Ah, Shizune-chan. The two lovers continued with their actions with one another, though Naruto now used his own chakra in his hands to pleasure Shizune's breasts and nipples as well, making it dead even between the two of them as they carried on with their actions. However, Naruto was not going to be content with just using his COC and hands on Shizune's body as he began to move back. Shizune had no choice but to follow him as he guided her to a nearby soft cover chair and then gently pushed her to sit down on the chair. Shizune wondered just what was going to happen this time, and she got her answer as Naruto began to go lower to her body while gently running his chakra-covered hands on her breasts and nipples once more, making her shiver as well as moan out deeply at his actions. Naruto then took her legs, gently lifted them to prop them on either side of the chair, and that allowed Shizune's vagina to be fully exposed before the blonde Chunin, and he couldn't help but smile a bit at the sight of his lover like this, her legs in a very seductive position and on the arms of the chair, and right there was Naruto, who was looking at her in a very aroused manner as she could see his COC become very rock hard, making her all the more aroused at how intensely Naruto gazed at her. Naruto-kun, what are you? Let me do it, Shizune-chan. Naruto then kneeled down and he now was face first with Shizune's vagina. He studied it very carefully, marveling at the sight of it. He had already seen it, but despite that fact, he always considered the sight of an aroused woman's sex to be a real turn on for him. He then moved closer until he was mere inches from her vagina. Naruto-kun, stop it. What? What should I stop doing, Shizune-chan? You're staring at me so intensely, it's so embarrassing. Naruto looked at Shizune and saw the intense blush on her face, and he smiled gently at her. You shouldn't be embarrassed of that, your vagina is unique and beautiful to me, and you smell so delicious. Shizune eeped as she heard that and couldn't help but feel even more aroused by the second as she could see the way that Naruto looked at her with such passion, desire, affection, and lust burning in his eyes. She was aroused beyond belief, probably because she was alone with the blonde Chunin. This, however, didn't frighten her in the least. She was so aroused and she did love Naruto, so she decided to let him have his fun. Thank you, Naruto-kun, do what you want to me. Thank you, Shizune-chan. Naruto then got things going as he sniffed her scent, and Shizune's scent from her vaginal juices met his expectations. Her scent was delicious. He moved closer until the tip of his nose hit Shizune's clitoris, making her gasp at the rush of sensation that ran up the sensitive bulb from the contact. Naruto grinned warmly at that and decided to go ahead as he let out his tongue and gave Shizune's vagina a slow and gentle lick from the bottom to the top, making Shizune moan out even louder in pleasure. He repeated the action, though it was in the reverse, getting more pleasure from the Jonin. The blonde was not done as he began to do it again, with various degrees of speed and movement, as he continued to lavish attention to Shizune's outer lips while focusing his chakra into his tongue to touch Shizune's pleasure centers even more, making the Jonin moan out even louder. He then did the same action on her clitoris, and this had a very arousing effect on the Jonin as she unleashed even more of her sweet juices for him to lick up. He then used his free hands to pleasure Shizune deeply. He used his right hand to part Shizune's outer vaginal lips, giving him access to the inner lips, and used his left hand to caress slowly her thighs. Ah, Naruto-kun. Shizune was in heaven as Naruto began to run his tongue gently on her vagina's inner lips along with her clitoris, and it took a great deal of her self-control not to lose it completely. Despite that determination, she couldn't help but feel her body react to the pleasure as more and more of her juices continued to flow out, and she could see Naruto lapping up those juices with gusto. It was then that she saw Naruto push in his tongue into her vagina, and the very second he did that, she wailed out in pleasure. Yes SSSS. Naruto-kun. Shizune cried out as she sat there on the chair totally naked as she looked down to see Naruto kneeling there between her parted legs and licking her vagina along with her clitoris with his tongue, as well as gently pushing in his tongue into her vagina, and he was soon doing those said motions in just the speed, depth, and way she liked. She reached out and held Naruto's head, hoping that he would get the message. He did, and gave her the pleasure that she wanted as he continued with his actions on her vagina as well as her clitoris. All the while, he couldn't help but feel his body reacting more intensely, and he felt himself grow even more aroused by all this as he felt his COC become even harder by the second. Naruto, however, focused on pleasuring the dark-haired Jonin. And sure enough, the effort he made to bring Shizune to orgasm was rewarded as the Jonin cried out her release while tensing up on the chair. Yes. Shizune cried out in absolute pleasure as she came hard while still sitting on the chair as the blonde Chunin continued to lap up all of her released juices. She couldn't help but feel the shivers of pleasure flow all over her body, from her crotch to her thighs, feet, toes, and all the way up to the very roots of her hair. She looked at Naruto, who had lapped up all of the juices she had unleashed on his face, and she couldn't help but feel even more aroused at the sight of Naruto's face stained by her juices. Shizune, however, was not the kind of woman who was not going to let a good thing or action go unrewarded. It was just not in her nature, so as she looked around in her house she spotted the nearby couch that she had. It was a simple and utilitarian couch, yet comfortable as well, with some soft pillows as well. She then decided that now it was going to be her turn to bring Naruto the same pleasure that he had given her. Naruto-kun, can you move? Naruto nodded and backed away to allow Shizune to lower her feet from the arms of the chair. Despite the position she was in before, the Jonin showed no discomfort with what happened between them, and she was smiling as she kissed Naruto, not caring for the taste of her own juices, having gotten used to that by now. She then licked her own juices off Naruto's face and then allowed Naruto to suck on her tongue, and then the two of them engaged in a torrid kiss. This allowed Shizune to get Naruto in the right position as she guided him to the couch that she had in her home. As soon as she got Naruto near the couch, the Jonin pushed him gently to land on the couch, and she wasted little time as she moved closer and kissed him deeply, and he responded in kind to her action. After they parted from the kiss, Shizune was making her move on the blonde as she ran her body on his once more, allowing her breasts to rub on his body. Shizune was pleased to hear Naruto moan out in pleasure at her actions as she then moved to place his COC between her breasts. She then began to move her body up and down. This allowed her breasts to caress either side of Naruto's COC. This naturally made the blonde Chunin and Dragon Champion react to the pleasure that the dark-haired Jonin was giving him. Shizune loved that and was happy that while she was not as well endowed as her sensei Tsunade, she was still able to pleasure Naruto the way he liked it done to him. She continued to use her breasts to pleasure the young Chunin while listening to his moans. She then moved her mouth and tongue into action as she began to lick and kiss the tip of Naruto's COC. The Jonin took her time as she pressed her breasts together to create a soft vice around her lover's COC to ensure that she was able to rub his COC well with her breasts. The blonde moaned out her name in such a way that she couldn't help but feel more aroused by the second. She then moved her breasts away and heard the moan out surprise and disappointment, but then heard him cry out in pleasure as she began to run her tongue and lips on his COC once more, with her chakra running in both mentioned parts of her body to touch the pleasure centers of his COC. The Jonin took her time licking, sousing and kissing her lover's COC, starting from base to tip and back, as well as licking and playing with his testicles gently to further add more pleasure to the blonde Chunin. As soon as she was assured that Naruto was fully ready, and so was she moved her mouth over his COC and slowly took his COC into her mouth, slowly and gently lowered her mouth on her lover's COC. She moaned a bit and the sensations made Naruto cry out her name once more. She relaxed herself, relying on her training to suppress her gag reflex, and took in Naruto's COC deeper and deeper into her mouth until she took in his full length. Shizune-chan. Naruto looked down at Shizune as she blushed deeply with his COC deep in her mouth. It was a very erotic sight, and he couldn't help but reach down with his hands and caressed her head gently, letting her have her fun with his COC. As soon as she was relaxed and used to Naruto's thick, hot, hard, and long COC in her mouth, Shizune began to move slowly, getting a pace down as well as a rhythm down, and her patience was rewarded well as she felt her pleasure grow at the feel of Naruto's COC in her mouth as she moved up and down slowly while rubbing her vagina and clitoris with her left hand while using her right hand to play with Naruto's testicles. She moved up and down slowly and then would release his COC to give attention to her testicles and then returning to his COC, taking it deeply into her mouth once more and lavishing the same attention to it, though this time she sped herself up a bit more. This carried on as Naruto and Shizune were getting into the whole spirit of things as the Jonin began to move at a much faster yet gentle pace. All the while the Jonin heard Naruto moan out her name as well as other sounds of pleasure as she continued to move her head up and down his COC. It was not long before Shizune felt Naruto's COC twitch as well as his body as well as the sudden increase of heat in his form. This was more than enough to tell her that he was about to orgasm, and sure enough, Naruto did orgasm. Yes. Naruto cried out as he unleashed a large stream of his cum into Shizune's mouth. He lay his head back on the couch while holding onto the sheets of the couch as he felt his COC fire out more streams of his cum into Shizune's mouth, which the Jonin took in without any reservations as she continued to suck and lick his COC with all her energy, making him moan even more in pleasure as his body was still tense and heated from the orgasm he just had. As for Shizune, she loved the taste of Naruto's cum a great deal, and the heat, sweetness, thickness, and amounts that she was able to take into her was enough to make her almost orgasm as well as her body began to get hotter. Her blush became more pronounced on her face as well as her vagina releasing more of her juices which were running down her thighs as well. She moved away and allowed of the still releasing cum of her lover to hit her breast as well as her face. She smiled and used her hands to clean the cum away, and she licked her hands clean as well, all for Naruto to see. As soon as he recovered from releasing all of his cum into Shizune's mouth, as well as watching her swallow his cum with relish, the blonde Chunin decided to look for a good way to make things even more wonderful for the two of them. He didn't have to look for very long as his eyes were soon drawn to the nearby dining table. He grinned a bit at that and he then spotted Shizune, who was looking in the same direction he was. Shizune smiled seductively to the blonde ninja and moved away from her kneeling position and walked to the table, swaying her hips in an undeniably way. She then leaned forward and held the table and parted her legs, allowing Naruto to see her dripping wet vagina as well as her well-formed and firm as before him. She smiled with the blush still on her face as she spoke to him. Naruto-kun, let's do it here. Yes, Shizune-chan. Naruto got up from the couch and moved towards the Jonin. He caressed her as first with his right hand and used his left hand to play with her breast while kissing her deeply. His hand's actions on her breast and her has made Shizune even more aroused by the second, and she wanted to feel Naruto's COCI on her vagina so much it was driving her to the limits. He saw that expression on her face and gave her the pleasure she wanted as the blonde moved behind Shizune, and then he placed his COC right in position. He then pushed deeply into Shizune in one fell stroke, burying himself deeply into her vagina to the very brim. He moaned mentally at the feeling of Shizune's inner walls caress and milk him. It was so tight that it drove him to near orgasm. Shizune on the other hand was already in orgasm as she felt herself being filled to the brim with her lover's COC, and she couldn't help but move upward somewhat from the pleasure of being filled by her lover's COC as well as the pleasure that flooded her from her orgasm. She gripped the table hard without drawing blood while she rose on her toes as the pleasure flowed through her body, and she could feel her vagina release more of her juices as it flowed down to coat Naruto's COC as well as run down her thighs. Naruto himself nearly came as he felt Shizune's orgasm flood all over him as her walls milked him hard as well as feeling the flow of Shizune's juices on his COC. He relaxed himself and allowed the sensations to flow over him as he thought about other things for a moment to calm himself. As soon as he was back to being fully calm, he began to move slowly in and out of Shizune's vagina. That first action was more than enough to get the dark-haired woman moaning out in pleasure. Naruto-kun, feels so good, more. Naruto complied as he began to move back and forth as Shizune began to relax herself and get into the groove of his thrusts into her vagina while he used his hands to steady her hips as he continued to thrust deeply into her vagina, and he couldn't help but feel his body become even more aroused with each deep thrust of his COC into her vagina. Yes, harder, faster. Yes, just like that. Shizune was in heaven as time passed as Naruto was now thrusting deeply into her vagina in a much faster and deeper yet still gentle pace. She was trying her best to remain upright throughout all this as the pleasure continued to flood her body as she felt each thrust of her lover's COC into her vagina deeply. The feeling of her vagina being filled to the brim by her lever's COC was too much for her, but she held on as best she could to make sure that this night was going to last for as long as she and Naruto could make it. It was then that the blonde Chunin then took one of her legs, namely her right leg, and lifted it. She gasped as Naruto held it up, and this allowed his thrusts to touch her in a more sensitive spot that really drove her pleasure to new height as she felt herself drooling a bit as well as her vagina releasing more of her juices. Naruto-kun. That's it. This continued between the two of them, and it was not long before Shizune got into the act as she began to move her hips in time with each thrust of Naruto's own hips. She would move back as well without his COC falling out of her vagina and then move backwards just as he moved forwards. This allowed Naruto's COC to hit the depths of her vagina all the way to her womb, and that action was enough to send even more waves of pleasure through her and through Naruto as well. It was not long before the pair were finally reaching their orgasm. But then Shizune managed to control herself and spoke to Naruto. Naruto-kun, stop, please. Naruto managed to retain enough of his mental control and slowed down as she requested. He however wondered just what was it that Shizune wanted, and he spoke to Shizune as soon as she was able to calm herself down. What's wrong, Shizune-chan? Shizune grinned and replied as she turned to face Naruto and replied. Nothing. I just want this to last before we hit the bedroom. Oh. Shizune nodded and replied. Besides, I do have other furniture here. Later. Shizune-chan. Naruto cried out as he sat on a smaller couch while Shizune was currently straddling him and moving up and down. He looked to see his lover moving up and down, her breast moving in time with her actions as her vagina was running up and down on his COC. He then kissed Shizune deeply while taking in her breasts and nipples into his mouth while using his hands to rub her back, sides, hips, and her buttocks as well. Shizune relished this as she continued to move her hips up and down along with moving it around when she got tired from all the up and down motions as she felt her vagina take in Naruto's COC time and time again. She then kissed Naruto deeply while she reached down to his body with her hands, which were still covered in her chakra, as she continued to touch Naruto's pleasure centers in his body. Yes. Deeper. Naruto and Shizune deeply kissed one another as she continued to move her hips up and down, and the two of them were able to hear the sounds of their love making as her vagina took his COC deeply into itself time and again. They were reaching their orgasm once more. But like before, they stopped before they would finally orgasm together, as there was still more for them to do, and as soon as they relaxed, Shizune then spotted yet another piece of furniture that they had not been able to use just yet. Naruto looked at what piece of furniture that Shizune was looking at and grinned a bit. Still later. Naruto-kun. Shizune cried out as she was lying on the sturdy coffee table in her living room as Naruto was currently thrusting his COC in and out of her vagina. Her legs were wrapped around his hips as she helped him thrust even deeper into her vagina. The blonde looked to see Shizune crying out in pleasure with each thrust that he made into her vagina. The sight of the dark-haired Jonin with her face flushed red, her brown eyes burning with passion, pleasure, desire, and love, her breasts moving in time with his thrusts, her sweat-covered form glittering lightly from the light being reflected by her sweat, and her vagina being filled by his COC with each thrust was enough to make him blush. Naruto loved this moment between the two of them and hoped that they were soon going to be able to bring one another to the release that they both wanted. Shizune was in heaven with what they were doing together, and she couldn't help but look at Naruto with a loving smile on her face as she moaned out her pleasure with each thrust he was doing to push his COC, and considering the position they were in, this allowed her to feel his COC hit the very neck of her womb, and the pleasure for her was growing even more with his actions on her body as she felt her vagina release even more of her juices out to coat Naruto's COC. Naruto and Shizune were about to reach the peak, but like before, the two of them stopped themselves from reaching their respective orgasm. It took a while before the two of them calmed down. They then kissed one another deeply to keep their passion at full flame, and as soon as they felt that they were fully relaxed, they looked about the room if there was another piece of furniture that would be used. It didn't take too long for the two of them to find one, or in this case, two. Yes, more. Naruto was sitting on a chair and parted his legs as Shizune was on top of his lap and moving up and down on his COC. The only difference was that they were now facing a mirror that allowed both of them to see the sight of the Jonin's vagina moving up and down on Naruto's COC as the Jonin apprentice of Tsunade was facing the mirror. This allowed the two to really see the act of sex in all its glory and beauty as Naruto busied himself with kissing and licking Shizune's neck, shoulder and earlobe while his hands were playing with both her brias as well as her clitoris as the Jonin moaned deeply in pleasure for what she was feeling as she continued to move, though in this case she was not doing all this by herself as Naruto was also moving his body in time with her movements, ensuring that the two of them were able to pleasure each other deeply. More Naruto-kun. Shizune-chan. The two looked at the mirror and both blushed as they could see her juices flowing out with each motion that the two of them did, and as time passed the two of them kissed one another deeply while they were still moving about. It was not long before they would be reaching their orgasm, but like before and with greater effort this time around, they stopped and managed to hold in their respective orgasm, and when that subsided for the moment, the two decided to go and look for yet another piece of furniture to use for their nightly romp. MMMMMM. Both lovers cried out as they were currently in a 69 position with Shizune on top of Naruto, who was using his mouth, tongue and fingers to pleasure both Shizune's vagina and clitoris as well as hers, while Shizune herself was using her mouth, tongue and fingers to pleasure Naruto's COC and his as well. The two were enjoying it deeply as they continued as she used her chakra to increase his pleasure while he did the same thing with his own chakra. The two were moaning into each other and the vibrations that they created was more than enough to send even more pleasure run through their bodies. They then felt their release coming, but they were finally able to control themselves and stopped despite the deep desire in them to finally achieve orgasm. This time, however, they were soon moving to the bedroom that Shizune had in her home. It was now time for the two of them to finally reach the pleasure that they both wanted. They could hardly wait. Finally in Shizune's bedroom. Yes. The two lovers were now on the bed with the two of them lying down, with Shizune lying down with her legs parted, but in this case, they were near her shoulders and were parted as well as resting in Naruto's arms, while the blonde was thrusting deeply his COC deeply away in her vagina on her. The blonde was more than willing to keep it as the two of them were kissing one another deeply, and when they parted, the blonde licked her brias and nipples, much to the Jonin's joy and pleasure. Yes. More. Deeper. Their previous romps in Shizune's house had been more than enough to make them so eager for release that it wouldn't be long before they were going to unleash their orgasm. As the blonde Chunin continued to thrust deeply into Shizune's vagina, it was not long before the two of them finally hit their full limits. Oh. Shizune cried out as she finally felt her orgasm hit her body like a tsunami hitting the beach as the pleasure moved through her nerves, flesh, and bones. She felt Naruto also unleash a large stream of cum into her vagina, and she soon felt him unleash several more massive streams of his cum into her vagina. The heat and feel of her lover's cum flowing into her womb was delicious as she moved her hips a bit to make her lover's COC move a bit more inside of her. Naruto himself thrust a bit more as she felt his orgasm unleash waves of hot and thick pleasure into his body, and it made him nearly lose his control as he thrust a bit more into Shizune's vagina. The feel of his lover's vaginal walls milking his COC as well as the feel of her vaginal juices flooding all over his COC was more than enough to make the blonde Chunin feel like he was going to pass out, but thankfully he was not going to do that. He then moved off Shizune and allowed her to relax as he gently caressed the dark-haired Kunoichi as she moaned out in pleasure from her orgasm, and he was more than willing to join her. Shizune lay on her bed panting as Naruto lay next to her, and she looked at the panting blonde Chunin who she began to love deeply for all he had done for her and how he saved her life months before. She was happy that she was able to have this private moment with him, and the fact that he was such a good man in all ways made her happy to have had him as a lover, and he was a great lover as she already knew. She then moved to caress her lover's face and she giggled a bit as Naruto reacted like a happy puppy as he moved his face and grinned happily at her. She couldn't help but smile at her lover's actions. No matter what, he was still such a lovable rascal. You're so funny when you do that, Naruto-kun. I know. I loved what we did, Shizune-chan, and I am happy that you're happy. Thank you, Naruto-kun. Now let's rest for tonight. Naruto nodded, but not before caressing Shizune's brias as well as her clitoris a bit, making her squirm in pleasure as he then kissed her deeply. the two remained close as they parted from the kiss and slept peacefully together. Tenten and Naruto. Tenten began to gently kiss the blonde Chunin and Naruto was more than willing to reply back with equal passion. They stayed there for a while since Tenten's parents were busy with other matters and would not be back for a while, leaving the two lovers well alone in the house. Tenten was naturally quick to take full advantage of that situation since she now had the chance to get Naruto alone with her for this night. With that in mind, she began to do what she wanted as the two of them kissed one another very deeply. Naruto was more than willing to let Tenten have her way for this night, and he was going to be more than willing to contribute to the night's soon-to-come festivities. With that done, he reached out and began to run his hands on Tenten's back using his chakra to touch the areas that he knew that Tenten would be aroused at when touched the right way. His actions were more than enough to make the woman moan out in appreciation as they continued to kiss one another, using their tongues in the process. As soon as they parted from one another, Tenten began to undress Naruto slowly, savoring the moments between the two of them. Though she had already seen him naked, she wanted this to be special for the two of them, so she did things slowly to make it a lot more interesting for the two of them. As soon as she was done with removing most of Naruto's clothes, she smiled at her lover as she took in his naked form so she could enjoy it. Tenten takes in the sight of Naruto like this and feels the evidence that he was very much aroused as she felt his cock rub her vagina underneath her, making her blush deeply at the sensations that she felt. Tenten smiled at Naruto as she leaned forward, kissing him deeply as the blonde Chunin responded to her actions in kind as well. The two kissed one another deeply while the young Kunoichi ran her hands on her lover's body slowly. As they parted from the kiss, she spoke seductively to her lover. "You're liking this a lot, aren't you, Naruto-kun?" Naruto smiled at that, but instead of verbally answering Tenten's question, he answered her physically, leaned forward and caressed her breast with his hands gently, making Tenten blush a bit more as well as smile even more at his actions. He then spoke to her warmly. "I take it you like that as well, Tenten-chan." Tenten merely smirked as she began to rub her body on his as well as rub her vagina on his cock. That action made the both of them moan as the sensations flooded through their bodies in that moment. The Kunoichi then moved down to Naruto's chest, kissing and licking his skin gently, making her even hotter as she felt her vagina begin to release even more of her moisture as it began to soak her panties. Tenten moaned out at that, and that was enough for Tenten to get down to it and strip away her clothes. The Kunoichi was methodical as well as slow despite the roaring fires of need that were in her body. She wanted this to be a good moment for her and her lover. Her patience along with her self-control was soon rewarded as she was now fully naked before him. Naruto smiled as he gazed hungrily at Tenten, but as he tried to reach out to her, the young woman stopped him from going any further with his intentions, and he was surprised by that as he had not expected this from the dark-haired Kunoichi. He was about to ask just why she was stopping him from doing what he wanted, and it was not long before Tenten gave him the answer that he was looking for the very second she stopped him. "I have something special for you, Naruto-kun." "Really?" Tenten nodded and she moved off Naruto's lap and moved away. She however did take his hand and made him leave the couch in her living room, and he followed her. The two naked lovers moved as Naruto didn't resist Tenten, and she then arrived at the kitchen and opened the freezer and took out a small box from the freezer. As soon as she took the box, she gave Naruto a seductive smile and then took him towards her bedroom. The two entered the room and then Tenten placed the box down as there was cold vapor coming from the box. She then opened the lid and there was a pair of sticks there. Tenten then took hold of one of the sticks and then pulled out the item, and there was a large piece of orange-colored ice. Naruto wondered just what Tenten intended to do with that piece of ice, which apparently was made from flavored water. He got his answer as Tenten began to rub it on her lips slowly and sensually. He grinned at that as he kissed her lips, finding the flavored water to taste like fresh orange juice that he happened to find very nice to his own taste buds. Tenten that ran the flavored piece of ice on her body, starting with her neck, and Naruto was quick to get the hint as he licked the trail, tasting Tenten's skin along with the orange-flavored water that was there. He already got the hint, and after Tenten recognized that fact, she kissed Naruto deeply, gave him the stick handle of the ice and then lay down on the bed, allowing Naruto to gaze at her fully naked body draped on her bed for him to gaze at for a moment or so. Naruto, however, having gotten the idea of the ice that Tenten had handed him, was now eager to put this piece of ice to the test as he started on Tenten's naked form. He went to run the ice on her face. making the young woman shiver at the cold sensation, which he then followed with the warmth of his tongue and lips as he licked and soused away the trailing water. He then gently had Tenten stick out her tongue as he ran the ice over it, and when he was done, he soused her tongue into his mouth, tasting both her and the orange juice-flavored water on her tongue. Tenten moaned at this as the two dueled with their tongues. Afterwards, the blonde Chunin then moved the ice back to her neck, past the place where her pulse was. He licked Tenten there, moving the ice to her collarbone, licking and kissing the skin there. He moved the ice to Tenten's considerably sized brius, rubbing the ice piece on the sides first, making Tenten moan as he kissed her deeply while doing those actions on her brius with the piece of ice. As soon as the kiss was over, the blonde Chunin went back to coating Tenten's brius with the ice. As soon as Tenten's brius were properly coated, he began to lick, kiss and suck the moisture off, along with using both his tongue and mouth with the ice piece on her nipples. As soon as they were hard, he soused on them gently and licked them. The kunoichi cried out deeply in pleasure at that, much to Naruto's delight over the whole situation before him, as he continued to use the ice stick on the dark-haired kunoichi, brius and nipples in conjunction with his mouth, lips, and tongue. Tenten moaned out as Naruto continued to run the cool stick of ice on her naked form, namely on her brius as well as her nipples. Ah, Naruto-kun. Naruto couldn't help but smile a bit at the undeniably kinky side of the weapon mistress of Konoha as he then slowly licked up the trails of moisture that had melted from the flavored stick of ice that Tenten had somehow been able to keep from him for some time. He could see that the feeling of cold liquid and then the feel of his hot flesh on her brius as well as her nipples was more than enough to make her even more aroused. As soon as he ran the ice stick on her brius, nipples and the valley between her brius, he then licked away the moisture with his tongue as well as using his lips to suck up the moisture, making Tenten cry out in even greater pleasure as her nipples were hard and her body shivered with absolute delight with his actions on her body. He slowed down with his actions to make sure that he lapped up all the fruit-tasting moisture that was on Tenten's brius, nipples and chest. As the young woman moaned out in joy at his actions, he then looked at the panting woman with a seductive smile as he spoke to her. I had no idea you were into this sort of thing, Tenten-chan. I just thought it would surprise you, Naruto-kun. I've honestly never did this before. Naruto smiled at that. So this is an erotic experiment. Hi, do you mind? Of course not. I happen to like it actually. Shall we carry on? Tenten nodded as she was still blushing deeply as the pleasure still coursed through her veins as the blonde Chunin took the stick of ice and began to run it over the rest of her body, making her cry out in pleasure as the cold liquid that ran over her as the ice began to melt. It was then replaced by the heat of her lover's tongue, making her body feel a multitude of pleasure mixed with the cool sensation of the ice on her body. Naruto continued with his actions on the brunette kunoichi, and as soon as he was done lavishing his attention her Tenten's upper form, he then made his way towards her lover body, running the ice piece slowly down her body, rubbing it gently on her sides, making Tenten moan and shiver as he then used his lips, mouth and tongue to follow the trails he made on Tenten's body. The blonde Chunin smiled mentally as he moved lower. He ran the ice stick on the young woman's stomach and around her belly button. He then licked Tenten's body slowly, making her cry out even more. Naruto-kun. Tenten was happy as the mix of cold and heat was strangely addicting to her, namely when she was doing this with Naruto and no one else. She had heard about this being something that was erotic, and she now found out that it really was erotic, and she was happy that her desire to find out was rewarded this. She then gasped as Naruto began to trail the ice stick on her thighs and she parted them reflexively. She gasped a bit more as Naruto began to gently run the stick over her thighs, leaving a trail of cold sensations up to her knees. Those sensations were then followed by the feel of Naruto licking her thighs with his tongue along with the feel of his lips and hot breath on her skin, adding even more delicious sensations to her body. Naruto-kun, feels so good. Naruto grinned at that as he focused his thoughts on how to make Tenten orgasm hard with the use of this piece of ice as well as his own body. He decided to start the whole thing off as he made it back to Tenten's brius, licking, sousing and kissing the well-formed brius and nipples. At the very same time he made sure to run the ice stick around Tenten's vagina near the outer lips as well as gently running it over her clitoris and vagina at the same time. Tenten was in heaven as the combined sensations threatened to drown her in pleasure as she felt the actions of Naruto's lips, mouth, and tongue on her brius and nipples, along with his use of the ice stick to tease her vagina as well as her clitoris. She looked at Naruto and they kissed one another deeply for a minute or two, and as soon as they parted, the blonde Chunin made his way back to her vagina and began to lick away the gathered juices there that were left behind by the ice stick, and then did the very same thing to the juices that he could see were coming out of Tenten's vagina. He wasted no time and took in as much as he could and found the combination of the orange-flavored water mixed with her juices was a very delicious mix, and he was more than ready to take in as much as he could handle. Tenten felt the pleasure flood her at Naruto's actions, and she purred out to try and make Naruto do what he could to bring her to orgasm. She didn't have to wait for very long as Naruto began to rub the ice stick on her vagina as well as her clitoris slowly and gently, making her gasp at the cool sensations that were not lasting very long because Naruto's hot tongue would then follow. She gasped as she felt him push his tongue into her vagina, making her cry out in pleasure as he also allowed the melting ice to drip its cool fluid on her vagina and her clitoris, which he licked up with considerable eagerness, as well as moving away from her vagina and gently running the ice piece on her vaginal lips and sometimes even pushing it into her vagina, making her cry out as he moved it slowly while licking her clitoris. Naruto-kun. The blonde Chunin smiled mentally as he carried on with his actions as he found the way Tenten was releasing more of her sweet juices to be undeniably erotic as he felt his COC twitch with the smell of her juices as well as the sight of the normally tough and serious Tenten being like this before him as he planned to make sure that he was going to bring his lover to full orgasm. The sight of that was something he was deeply looking forward to at this time. He noted that the ice piece was beginning to melt quickly, but he didn't mind. It was to be expected, so he was going to make do with it for as long as it lasted. Tenten cried out deeply at the pleasure that flooded her body as Naruto began to do everything he could in his power to bring her the release she craved the very second she started this whole thing with him. She wanted to show Naruto a good time, and considering how he was pleasuring her, she was doing a very good job at it as well. The brown-haired kunoichi couldn't help herself as she reached down with her hands to play with the hair of her lover as he continued to use his mouth, lips, tongue, and the ice stick that she had handed him to make her moan and cry out in pleasure. This carried on for a while, and Naruto couldn't help but feel his arousal grow at the sight of Tenten being like this, all thanks to his actions. His COC was eager for release and his body was screaming to him for him to skip this and go ahead and plunge his COC deeply into Tenten's vagina. But the blonde Chunin wanted to make sure that Tenten was able to fully enjoy the pleasure she already felt, and since she was already reaching her limit, he was going to make sure she reached in the most delicious way possible. The blonde continued to lick his lover's vagina as well as her clitoris while using the now melting ice stick, and the taste of her juices mixed with the fruit-flavored water was very much delicious as he continued to gently move the ice stick around her vagina as well as gently push it in and out of Tenten's vagina as she cried out in pleasure at his actions on her. He felt her body tremble and shake. Those were enough to tell him that she was now going to orgasm. He then pushed both his tongue and the ice stick into her vagina at that exact moment, and the results were worth it as the brown-haired kunoichi finally released her full pleasure. Ah! Tenten cried out in orgasm at the pleasure that flooded her body, and she gripped the sheets of her bed as she tensed up in her release. As she was floored by her orgasm, she could feel the heat in her vagina mix with the now fading cold of the ice stick that Naruto used on her vagina as well as her clitoris along with the heat of her own release. She felt Naruto lap up her juices with his tongue, and the feel of that was delicious as waves of pure pleasure flowed up and down her spine. Naruto himself took the ice stick as it was now soft enough for him to eat, and he ate it. The mix of the orange juice flavored ice that was mixed with Tenten's own juices was delicious as he lapped up more of her moisture as she released a good stream of it out of her vagina. He licked it all up as well as her clitoris. He loved the taste as well as the sensations of the ice melting in his mouth along with it being mixed with Tenten's juices. It was a delicious mix that he was more than willing to take into his mouth. Once that was over, the two lovers faced one another as Tenten relaxed her body after her earth-shattering climax. She turned to face Naruto at that moment, and then the two of them kissed one another deeply. This allowed Tenten to taste the mix of her own juices and the orange-flavored water in Naruto's mouth that was mixed with his own taste as well. Both of them found it delicious and they kissed one another deeply to make sure that they were not going to lose the taste. As soon as they were done, Tenten spoke to Naruto. So, do you like that little test, Naruto-kun? Yeah, so what now? Now it's my turn to have fun. You had your turn after all. Naruto had a feeling that was going to be Tenten's answer as she moved to the box and took hold of the other stick and revealed the second ice stick. Only different was it seemed to be somewhat wider than the other one that he had been using before, and the fact that it was cherry red. The brown-haired kunoichi had a very interested smile on her face now that she had the thing in her hand as she moved slowly towards Naruto with the new ice toy in hand. As Tenten came closer to her, Naruto had a feeling that he was about to get a serious treatment that was really going to push him to the limit, and the way Tenten looked at him was more than enough to make him somewhat nervous, but he was willing to let his lover have her turn as he liked to be fair after all. Tenten started by running the ice on Naruto's lips, making Naruto realize that it was cherry-flavored with a hint of strawberries, two things he would have never thought would be associated with the tough and battle-hardened female genin. He didn't bother her as she continued with her actions as she licked his lips gently. She then moved to coat his cheeks with the ice and then licked them. She moved the ice stick lower, running it gently on his neck, right where his pulse was. She then slowly licked the trails of water away, making him feel the heat and cold at the very same time. The kunoichi then began to move to the rest of Naruto's upper form. She started by running the ice stick on her lover's chest as well as his nipples, making him cry out a bit at the cold sensations that hit his body and then the hot sensations as she began to lick away the cool liquid on her lover's form, along with gently sousing his own nipples, making the blonde chunin grip the bed sheets as if his life depended on it. Tenten. Wow. Tenten moved back to her lover as she spoke to him in a very seductive tone. You like that? Yeah, I had no idea you were this kinky. Tenten grinned and replied, normally I'm not, but after that time with Ayame-san, and Temari-san, I guess a little uniqueness is good for a relationship, right? I'm not complaining. Thanked Kami for that then. Now where was I? Tenten continued with the use of her own ice stick or rather paddle as she made her way to his stomach, running the ice slowly on her lover's form, loving the way he shivered and moaned as she did so. She then made the move to lick and kiss her lover, body in the areas that she traced with the ice paddle. Naruto was doing his best to hold his own while Tenten reached her stomach, running the ice paddle on that part of him, and he licked the moisture clean, in turn tasting Naruto's skin. She loved that taste as she then moved to see her lover's COC already fully aroused and hard. Tenten loved the sight of it and she felt her vagina drip more of her moisture at the thought of her being filled by her lover's COC once more as she recalled the first time she had been filled to the brim by Naruto's COC. It had been some time since those days, and now that she had him all alone to herself, she was going to enjoy this for as long as she could manage. She placed that aside for the time being and focused on running her ice paddle on her lover's thighs, both on the outside and then the inside. She then licked the moisture off her lover's thighs with the blonde moaning out his approval for her actions. With that done, the kunoichi then directed her attention to her lover's COC. She then used the ice paddle that she had and began to run the thing over her lover's COC, starting at the base and moved it all the way to the tip, moving it around as well as the blonde chunin cried out from the sensations she was giving him. Ah, cold. Tenten then moved in with her mouth and tongue. She then began to lick and kiss her lover's COC as well as his testicles. The blonde chunin couldn't help but moan out at the feel of Tenten's hot tongue on his COC as well as his testicles. The blonde chunin looked as the brown-haired kunoichi used her ice paddle with her mouth and tongue to send even more pleasure up and down his spine, and he was more than ready to show his pleasure at Tenten's actions. Tenten, this feels good. Tenten looked at her lover as she was licking and sousing Naruto's COC, loving the expressions on his face as she continued to do what she was doing to her lover's COC and testicles. The kunoichi then took the next step as she slowly took Naruto's full length into her mouth, relishing the feel of her lover's COC in her mouth. The warmth, hardness, length, and thickness of Naruto's COC was something that she missed a considerable deal since it had been a while since they had done this together. She took all of his COC until it hit the back of her throat and she stayed there for a bit longer, allowing Naruto to feel the heat in her mouth this time around. She then slowly began to use her tongue to make sure that Naruto felt it. Yes, your mouth is so hot, Tenten-chan. Naruto enjoyed this deeply and then wondered what was next as he looked at the kunoichi. He didn't have to wait for too long as Tenten moved away for a moment as she looked at the ice as it was melting a bit faster. She then took it into her mouth and ate some of it by biting down hard. The brown-haired kunoichi relished the taste and ate the rest of the ice but didn't swallow all of it, and before Naruto could figure out what she was going to do, she gave the answer as she took in his COC once more. Oh. Naruto couldn't help himself as he felt his COC being covered by Tenten's mouth, which was now both cold and hot due to the natural heat in it, and the cold due to the ice in there as well. The blonde had no idea that hot and cold could work together as he felt his COC become very hard indeed at the dual sensations. Tenten started slowly with her actions as she moved her head up and down over Naruto's COC while using her hands to massage his thighs and testicles at the very same time. Tenten herself had to admit that this idea was certainly something different to her senses as she continued to move her head up and down while using her tongue on Naruto's COC. The kunoichi loved the way Naruto was moaning and crying out, as well as feeling the effects on her actions on her own body as she felt her vagina release even more of her juices at this moment, and it felt very addicting to her to say the very least as she continued with her desire to finally taste Naruto's cum mixed with the flavor in her mouth as the ice continued to melt in her mouth. The combination of the taste of the flavored water and Naruto's COC was arousing her even more as she began to pick up the pace with her movements while using her now free hand to play with her clitoris. It was not long before the two of them were finally reaching their full limits as Naruto felt Tenten cry out despite his COC being in her mouth as she climaxed. That was more than enough to finally make him reach his own limits as he came hard. Yes. Naruto cried out deeply as he felt his orgasm hit him deeply in all parts of his body as he released his cum into Tenten's mouth. He felt the heat and cold there in her mouth as she continued to move her head up and down on his COC. The Chunin couldn't help but feel his COC fire several more thick bursts into Tenten's mouth, and he felt her take it all without even showing any form of discomfort throughout the whole thing. He could only watch as Tenten managed to take it all, and to his amazement, she swallowed it all in one go, making him feel his brain cook at the sight before him. Such an image was going to nearly impossible for him to forget anytime soon. He looked as Tenten relaxed herself as she blushed brightly at him, and he got hard once more. He however allowed Tenten to relax herself for a bit. As soon as she relaxed, Tenten moved forward to kiss him deeply. Naruto didn't mind that as the two of them rubbed their bodies on one another gently, making them feel somewhat hotter than before, and it was then that Tenten decided to take this to the final stage as she lay down on the bed and parted her thighs, beckoned to Naruto to make his move on her. Naruto grinned as he moved between Tenten's parted thighs and then began to push his COC into her vagina. He leaned forwards to her as he did so and kissed her deeply. He moaned into the kiss as the tip of his COC was parting her vagina's outer lips. Tenten gasped a bit as he carried on in pushing his COC deeper and deeper into her vagina, and it was not long before Naruto was finally buried deep into Tenten's vagina. He moaned out his pleasure that how hot Tenten's vagina was. He felt that his COC was going to melt in the heat, tightness, softness, and wetness of his lover's vagina. As for Tenten, Naruto-kun, Tenten cried out as she finally felt her lover's hot, thick, hard and long COC fill her vagina to the very brim, and as soon as he was buried deeply into her, she couldn't help but orgasm once more. The pleasure of feeling her vagina being filled by her lover's COC and the orgasm that followed was nearly enough to drive her to the edge as she held the bed sheets tightly in her hands. Naruto also gritted his teeth as he felt Tenten's vagina milk his COC hard as she came hard on him. He managed to hold it all together, and as soon as he was sure that she was fine, he began to move his hips slowly. He drew out his COC slowly from her vagina and then pushed right back in, making Tenten grip his arms hard as she cried out his name due to what he had just done to her body. Yes. Tenten cried out as Naruto took her legs and then placed them on his shoulders while taking a good grip of her hips with his hands as he began to move his hips back and forth in a slow but deep and hard pace, making sure that he drove deeply into her vagina. She loved that as it allowed Naruto's COC to hit her in the spot that sent massive waves of pleasure all over her body, which she really loved feeling after all that they had been doing before. The blonde Chunin continued with his actions, slowly speeding up when he could hear his lover cry out for him to give her even more pleasure with his COC. He looked to see Tenten as her breasts, which were perfect for her frame and build, moving up and down with each thrust of his hips and his COC moving in and out of her vagina. Her face flushed with 2 spots of deep red on her cheeks, the way she took in her breath in short but loud cries as he continued to move in and out of her vagina. Ah, Naruto-kun. Yes. Harder. Deeper. The kunoichi was utterly in heaven as she felt her vagina being filled to the brim by her lover's COC. It made her feel more alive than ever before as her body reacted the way she wanted as more and more of her juices came out of her vagina and was coating Naruto's COC, making it more sleek as he thrust himself deeply into her vagina at an increasing pace that drove the young woman even closer to orgasm. The two screamed out their pleasure, and Tenten was happy that her room had thick walls, or else who knew who might be listening into this. The last thing she wanted was anyone finding out about her having sex with Naruto. She loved him a good deal after he had changed and grown stronger. Not to mention his kindness, compassion, selflessness and courage were undeniably attractive to her, and after losing her virginity to him she wanted him to be with her for as long as possible. Naruto was going at full throttle at this point, pulling out of Tenten's vagina and pushing deeply back in while the brown-haired kunoichi was crying out her joy and pleasure with each thrust he gave to her, as she also responded in kind by moving her hips in time with his thrusts. It was not long before the two of them would hit the point of orgasm, and as soon as they hit it, the both of them reached their limits at that exact moment. Yes, SSSSSS. Tenten cried out as she climaxed hard as she felt her lover's COC fire out another thick, hot and strong burst of cum into her vagina as she felt her inner walls milk her lover's COC. More hot streams of Naruto's cum filled her vagina. She was happy that she was not fertile at the moment, since she was not yet ready to have a baby just yet. When she would be older, then maybe she would love to have a family, but for now she was going to make certain that she and Naruto had all the time they needed to be together. Besides, there was always a way in life to get what one wanted, and she wanted Naruto. She placed that aside for now as she kissed him as he placed her legs down from his shoulders and leaned towards her. Naruto felt Tenten's inner walls milk him for all he was worth as he continued to fire more of his cum into her vagina. The look of her like this as he kissed her was a very delicious sight, and he was not going to forget it for as long as possible. The blonde kissed her deeply as he slowly pulled away from her. Hearing his COC come out of Tenten's vagina, it was a very erotic sound as he lay next to the panting weapon mistress of Konoha. As the two of them relaxed in each other's arms, the young kunoichi hugged her lover and gently licked the blonde's earlobe in a very gentle fashion, making the blonde laugh a bit at her actions. He turned and kissed her a bit on the lips, and she responded with a torrid kiss to him. When they parted, he spoke to her. I wonder what, Naruto-kun, if we do this again, are you going to use the ice again? Tenten grinned and replied, only if you want to, Naruto-kun, only if you want to. Naruto smiled as they hugged one another and kissed deeply. They soon parted and then closed their eyes while being entangled together as sleep claimed the two of them. Naruto did his best to hold both the women as they were in a still shocked state, and while this was not what he had in mind in order to calm both Ino and Sakura, he didn't have much choice to say the very least, and he couldn't blame them for the way they were acting at this moment as he held them each. It was not long before the two women made their moves on him as they kissed him deeply once more, as the three of them were kissing one another deeply. As soon as the three stopped kissing one another, the pink-haired kunoichi then ran her hands on her lover's body, happy that he was right there with them and was alive. As she did this to Naruto, she couldn't help but smile at his willingness to be with them to make sure that they were both in good hands. The same could be said for Ino as she ran her own hands on Naruto's muscled form. The fact he was here and with her was more than enough to make her happy to be with him. After what she experienced and faced this day, she needed all the comfort she could get, and with Naruto providing that said comfort, the blonde kunoichi felt safer still. As they were done rubbing their hands on his naked body, the two looked at one another. Normally they would have glared at one another and were sending the evil eye had things been different and they were back to fighting over Sasuke, but this was indeed different and there was no hostility within the two girls. Besides, they both had been intimate with Naruto already, so no sense fighting over him. Sakura started first as she took one of Naruto's hands and then placed it on her breast, as the blonde was quick on the uptake as he began to massage her breast gently along with her nipples as well, and the touch was more than enough to arouse her. She saw a faint glow of chakra in her lover's hands, showing to her that he was using his chakra to stimulate her body as well as make her relax. It was welcome to her as she allowed Naruto to continue with the movements of his hand on both her breasts. Ino herself was more than eager to take Naruto's free hand into her own as she began to gently lick and suck on the fingers, making her the blonde Chunin moan out in surprise at her actions as he was not expecting her to be doing that of all things, but he didn't mind as she continued with her actions until she moved his hand to her own brias, allowing Naruto use his hands on her brias while he also used his chakra on his hand to pleasure both her brias. The blonde Kunoichi loved the attention she was getting from her lover and hoped that they were going to be all right. Naruto then began to move his hands down to reach their vagina. He started first with their stomachs, trailing his fingers slowly down until he reached the patches of soft fur between their thighs, which they parted the very second the two of them felt his hands go down their bodies. As soon as he reached their thighs, he began to rub his hands slowly on their thighs on both their legs, tracing his hands slowly on their thighs to make sure that he was able to pleasure them both at the very same time. Both Kunoichi moaned out deeply at this as they decided to make Naruto feel good as well. With that plan in mind, the two Kunoichi reached out with their hands and once more began to touch and caress Naruto's body, only this time, the two of them moved their hands directly to Naruto's COC. As soon as they were able to reach their lover's COC, the two women began to move their hands over Naruto's COC along with his testicles. They then began to kiss Naruto deeply as well when he turned to face them at regular moments. This allowed for some rather deep kissing between the three of them. Both Sakura and Ino loved that as they were not going to hesitate in making each kiss more passionate than the last one that they had with Naruto. As for Naruto, he could feel his COC naturally react to the hands of both the two women as it twitched as well as get even harder by the second, and it seemed that the women were more than willing to make him even harder, which was all right with him for the time being as he then moved his fingers on their vagina, making both moan out his name at the very same time. Naruto-kun. Ino and Sakura didn't mind that they spoke out their mutual lover's name as they felt his hands now playing with their vagina as well as their clitoris. It was something that the two of them wanted in the first place as the pleasure shot through their bodies at a much stronger as well as faster rate with each movement of his fingers in their respective vagina. Both of them were feeling the pleasure grow stronger and thicker in them as they decided to give Naruto a good reward for making them feel this kind of pleasure. Both women moved their hands away and moved a bit further from Naruto, forcing him to move his hands away. He wondered what they were going to do to him. He soon got his answer as the two of them placed his COC between their brias and he moaned out deeply at the feel of both Ino and Sakura's brias surrounding his COC all at once. He had no idea just where the two of them came up with this action, but he was not going to complain in the very least as he moaned when they began to move their brias together, allowing him to feel their brias all over his COC. Ino-chan. Sakura-chan. Both Kunoichi loved that cry as the two of them now knew just what was the best way for them to pleasure Naruto in a mutually beneficial fashion as they continued to move their bodies, and in doing so their brias as well as Naruto lay on the bed and was still moaning out in pleasure at their actions on his body. They also took turns licking and kissing the tip of his COC to further pleasure him. The results of their actions also happened to be seen on them as they felt their vagina grow hotter and wetter with each passing second. They could feel their juices coming out of their vagina, and that was more than enough to make the two women even more interesting, brining their lover to the release he wanted. It was not long before the blonde Chunin was reaching his limits, which was very much obvious to the two female Kunoichi, and they would not have it any other way as the two of them kissed and licked his COC with a greater deal more passion until Naruto finally shouted out his orgasm. Yes. Both Ino and Sakura took in as much of their lover's cum as they could manage. Sakura was the first. She took all that she could take and moved away afterwards, allowing Ino to take her own share of Naruto's cum. Both of them relished the taste of their lover's cum in their mouths, and that served to really make them all the more aroused. The two felt several more streams of Naruto's cum fly out from his COC and hit their brias as well as their faces. They loved that feeling as they then parted from Naruto's COC and sat in front of Naruto as he looked at the two of them once he recovered. Both of them looked at one another and nodded as they first swallowed the cum they had in their mouths. As soon as that was over, the two women then came closer and began to clean each other's face and brias. Sakura was the first and cleaned Ino completely of all the cum she had on her body. And when the pink-haired Kunoichi moved away, the blonde-haired Kunoichi did the very same thing, cleaning her partner's body with her own tongue. As soon as they were done cleaning each other, both of them kissed one another deeply while moving their tongues inside their mouths for Naruto to as well as rubbing their naked forms on one another. This sight was more than enough to make Naruto feel even more aroused by the second as he felt his COC harden once more. Both women noted that as they smiled warmly in his direction after the two of them parted formed the deep kiss that the two of them had been in together earlier. As they moved towards Naruto, they also decided to let Naruto have his turn with them to be fair as they moved into position with Sakura Bello and Ino on top of her, allowing both their vagina as well as their clitoris to be on top of one another as well. The sight was too good for Naruto to ignore and he moved towards them and licked their vagina, making both of them cry out in that exact moment of pleasure. Oh 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 h h h h h h h h h. Naruto was more than ready to make them orgasm the same way they had made his orgasm only moments before as he gently licked their vagina as well as use his fingers to further increase their own pleasure by the second. The two women were more than willing to show their appreciation as their respective vagina released more of its juices, which Naruto tried separately first and then he allowed their juices to mix at that moment. He then tasted Ino and Sakura's combined juices to find them to be very unique and in this case, rather delicious to his taste buds as he lapped up more of it as well as using his fingers to further pleasure the two women to reach their orgasm, as the sight of both women in orgasm at once was something that the blonde Chunin was very much looking forward to. Apart from using his tongue to lick their vagina, he also pushed his tongue deeply into their vagina, doing so allowed him to feel their inner walls move about over his tongue, making the blonde Chunin all the more aroused by the second at the feel of their respective vaginal walls moving on his tongue along with his fingers. Naruto also took a good time smelling their combined releases of their fluids and the smell was good to his nose, further driving to him to arousal as he went back to trying to bring the two women to orgasm. He didn't have to wait for too long as his actions finally brought both women to orgasm and it was a sight that Naruto loved. Ah! Both Ino and Sakura cried out in pleasure as they both reached their respective orgasm at the very same time. Their vagina released more of their juices which soon mixed with one another and Naruto was now busy lapping up as much of their combined juices as he could. The two women also moved their bodies as well, allowing Naruto watch as they moved in a very erotic fashion right before his eyes. Both Ino and Sakura relished their orgasm as when they looked at Naruto whose face was covered in their juices, the two didn't hesitate in the very least to go towards him and begin to lick his face clean of their own juices. It was arousing to the three lovers as they once more were in a torrid three-way kiss while the two women were busy rubbing their bodies on their male lover along with using their hands to caress his COC while his also caressed their still dripping wet vagina. When the three of them finally parted with one another, it was here that both Sakura and Ino parted with Sakura whispering into Naruto's ear gently. Naruto-kun, can you make Ino-chan happy for the time being? Naruto wondered why that was the case, but recalling Ino's experience in using her family's trademark jutsu on a werewolf, he decided to agree to Sakura's suggestion to him and made his way to the blonde kunoichi, much to Ino's happiness, and she hugged Naruto while Sakura decided to stand by and watch what was going to happen between the two blonde ninja from Konoha. This was not going to be boring to say the very least. Ino managed to giggle as she was now taking her turn with Naruto as she and the blonde Chunin was more than willing to go at it with her at this moment, and she loved that as they kissed one another deeply while she ran her hands over Naruto's naked form once more. As soon as she was done exploring Naruto's naked form, the blonde kunoichi felt her lover's hands on her brias once more and she couldn't help but blush as Naruto then began to massage her brias with his hands as well as use his mouth and tongue on them to make her all the more aroused. Naruto himself continued to use his hands in conjunction with his mouth to pleasure Ino's brias while rubbing one of his thighs on her vagina and clitoris slowly, making her moan out even more as well as make him feel the wetness that was coming from her vagina all the more easily. He smiled mentally at that as he continued with pleasuring Ino's brias a lot more with both his hands and tongue while using his thigh to pleasure Ino's vagina as well as her clitoris. Naruto-kun. Ino moaned out deeply as the pleasure for her continued to grow by the second. She then decided to make her own move on Naruto as she stopped him from pleasuring her brias any further. Though sad from the lose of contact, the blonde kunoichi already went to work as she then reached Naruto's COC and began to rub her brias on it once more as well as moving her brias back and forth on Naruto's COC from either side, allowing Naruto to see his COC rubbing not just her brias but her nipples as well. Ino then made Naruto stand on his knees as she moved in closer to his COC, making the blonde Chunin all the more aroused as she was on her hands and knees, already eye level with his COC, and the way it looked was rather arousing to the two of them. The blonde Kunoichi was not done as she once more took Naruto's COC to her mouth, gently licking and kissing it once more. She ran her tongue from the tip to the base while gently running her tongue around the tip slowly to make sure she got every part of Naruto's COC fully explored by her tongue. She did the very same thing to both the base of his COC along with his testicles. The pleasure for her continued to grow until she finally took Naruto's COC deep into her mouth. Ino countered her body's gag reflex and took her lover's COC deeply into her mouth until she reached the base of his COC, and that was more than enough to make Naruto cry out even more. As soon as she was ready, she moved her body backwards until Naruto's COC was nearly out of her mouth. She then moved back forward, allowing Naruto's COC to be driven all the way to the back of her mouth, touching her throat. The moment that happened, she moaned a good deal at the pleasure that ran through her at that instant, and she could already tell that Naruto himself was also aroused by her actions on his COC as he cried out her name once more. Ino-chan. Ino was pleased by that greatly as she began to start moving once more, setting up a pace and rhythm while still moving her tongue to make sure that she was able to orally caress her lover's COC the right way. Naruto was enjoying the sight before him as Ino continued to move her body back and forth, allowing her to take in his COC in and out of her mouth. He couldn't help but be aroused at the sheer aggressive but passionate way Ino was doing this to him, and vowed to do something that would make her happy in return for this rather unique situation. As much as he wanted to be moving his hips, he decided to let Ino have her fun for this time. However, that certainly didn't mean he was going to be idle the whole time. He reached out with his hands and began to play with her brias once more, along with running his hands on her body as well as her face, making sure to do his best to pleasure Ino while she continued with her actions on his COC. The blonde Chunin was more than willing to moan out his approval of Ino's actions at this moment as she began to move faster. Ino loved this moment as she felt her vagina become even wetter with all the actions she was taking while continuing to pleasure Naruto in this position that they were currently in. She could feel the pleasure flowing through her body as Naruto's hands were on her brias and nipples, then moving to the rest of her body. It made her all the more eager to finally take this to the next level, and she was more than willing to do just that as she moved away, but not before making sure to give Naruto's COC a good deal of licking and kissing. As soon as that was done, the blonde Kunoichi lay down on the bed and beckoned for Naruto to do what he wanted to her, as she was quite eager for him to take his turn with her. Naruto was more than willing to go ahead, but decided to do this in a way that would really make Ino happy. He then took out a small length of cloth and then used it to blind Ino. He gently tied it so it would be removed easily, and then did the same with another bolt of cloth to tie her hands gently. Ino was more than willing to do this as she moaned out in pleasure as Naruto began to kiss her face as well as lick her cheeks slowly. He then gently kissed her on the lips and began to move his arms all around her, making sure to touch the pleasure centers of her body using his chakra, and the results of his actions were obvious as she moaned out in pleasure the feel of his hands on her body. Naruto smiled at that as he continued to use his hands, but then began to use his lips and tongue, also coating both with chakra along with his hands. He licked Ino's brias once more while using his fingers to pleasure the rest of her body, along with her vagina as well as her clitoris, making her even more aroused by the second. Naruto took the situation further as he moved his mouth away from Ino's brias and moved to her vagina and clitoris while moving his hands to her brias. Ino cried out in pleasure the very second she felt Naruto's lips and tongue on her vagina as well as her clitoris. Ino wanted to do something, but she couldn't help but find this situation to be rather interesting as well as arousing, so she lets Naruto do what was already doing. The fact that she couldn't see where he was and what he was doing to her body added a very strong element of surprise to the whole situation before the two of them. She didn't mind at all in the least as she was enjoying the game of trying to guess where Naruto was going to go to next with his actions. She got her answer when Naruto began to run his COC on her brias slowly, making her moan out in pleasure at that as she then felt it move between her brias, with Naruto gently pressing her brias together and began to move his hips a bit more, making her feel the heat coming from her lover's COC. The blonde Kunoichi enjoyed this as Naruto then moved away. He then moved between her thighs, gently rubbing his COC on Ino's inner thighs, and it was enough to make the blonde kunoichi moan out even more. Yes. It was not long before Naruto decided to place this whole situation to a head as he moved into position and then pushed his COC slowly into Ino's vagina, parting the outer lips gently, and doing the very same thing to the inner lips, and soon he pushed his COC deeply into her vagina all the way to the base, making Ino tense up and hiss in pleasure. Naruto smiled as he began to move his hips in and out of Ino's vagina, doing so slowly, drawing himself nearly out and then driving himself deeply back into her. He relished the feeling of it all as he leaned forward, kissing Ino deeply as well as gently kissing the tip of her nose as well as her forehead, making the blonde kunoichi blush at how gentle Naruto was with her at this moment. And as Naruto continued to pick up the pace of his thrusts in and out of his lover's vagina, Ino couldn't help but moan out her pleasure and encouragement to Naruto as he began to speed up. Faster, harder, deeper. Ino loved the pleasure that came with Naruto's thrusts into her vagina, which were now faster and harder, making Naruto's COC go deeply into her vagina almost to the brim. Naruto himself loved the pleasure as he then reached down and lifted Ino's tied arms and loped them over his head and onto his shoulders. The blonde kunoichi was quick on that and held onto Naruto tightly as he continued to move his COC in and out of her vagina. Naruto then decided to reach with his hands and remove the cloth that closed Ino's eyes, allowing her to see him. The blonde kunoichi smiles warmly at being able to see her lover's face and kisses him deeply. The two carried on the kiss, and this time with tongues involved, as well as Naruto continued to increase the strength of his thrusts into her vagina. The pleasure for them increased their kiss, and they soon parted just as she finally reached her full orgasm. Yes. Naruto relished the feel of Ino's inner walls milking his COC deeply, and the release of her juices all over his COC was undeniably delicious for him as well as it was for her. He then licked Ino's lips, making her stick out her tongue, and he didn't waste any time taking it into his mouth to suck on it deeply, as the two of them went into kissing each other once more. Ino herself loved the feel of her lover's cum flowing into her vagina deeply, and when the first stream hit her inner walls at that moment she couldn't help but feel more alive than before when that happened to her body. She then moaned out as the blonde chunin soused on her tongue, eventually kissing her deeply while he continued to fire more of his seed into her eager SX. As soon as they were done with what they were doing to one another, Naruto gently pulled himself out of Ino's vagina and then kissed her gently as well as freeing her hands. He knew that with the smile on her face as well as her blush, she was going to be fine, and now was the right time for him to focus his attention on Sakura, who as far as he could tell was eagerly waiting for him to come to her at this time. Ino smiled deeply as she allowed Naruto to finish the last round with Sakura as she looked on despite feeling very sleepy from her earth-shattering orgasm earlier, along with feeling the heat from Naruto's cum in her body. She wanted to see this to the very end. Sakura cried out a bit as soon as Naruto was focused on her, and she was more than eager for this moment between the two of them as soon as Naruto was moving towards her. She had been playing with herself the whole time. Her hands had been playing with her brius, nippus, as well as her vagina and clitoris. Now it was going to be Naruto who was going to be doing those very same things to her, and she was more than willing to let him do those said things to her. As soon as Naruto was with her, the two of them kissed one another deeply as well as sousing on one another's tongue. That action was more than enough to send waves of pleasure up and down their bodies while both of them reached down with their hands. Sakura took hold of Naruto's COC, gently giving the blonde's COC a good round of touching along with his testicles at the very same time. This made Naruto moan out, and the pink-haired kunoichi was more than willing and eager to take full advantage of that moment. As soon as the two of them parted from one another, Sakura began to kiss Naruto's chest, running her hands on his naked form, and used her chakra to touch Naruto's own pleasure centers, as well as doing the same thing on his COC and testicles. That made Naruto's COC become harder, and also made the blonde chunin even more eager to make Sakura really cry out his name in release. But Naruto manages to keep his control strong, and he replied in kind by running his own hands on Sakura's body. He reached down to feel her vagina, finding it to be wet, and when he pushed one of his fingers into her vagina gently, he could tell that she was really wet and eager. So he decided to try something that would help relieve some of their respective arousal. Sakura-chan, let's do this. Do what, Naruto-kun? Naruto smiled and gently kissed the tip of Sakura's nose and replied. Trust me. Sakura smiled at that as she did trust Naruto greatly and decided to play along with whatever her blonde lover had in mind. Naruto lay down on his side in the other direction while Sakura lay down in the other direction as well. The pink-haired Kunoichi then moved his legs upward and towards her body and Naruto moved towards her vagina, and licked it slowly while using his free hand to pleasure her vagina along with his tongue, making the pink-haired Kunoichi moan out. Yes SSS. Sakura however was far from idle as she then reached out and moved her head to take Naruto's COC into her mouth as well to make sure things between the two of them were going to be very much even. She also did the same with her lover's testicles to make sure that those parts of her lover were given enough equal attention to even the situation out between the two of them. The pleasure she gave Naruto was more than enough to make the blonde double his efforts in turn. Yes. Sakura-chan. The two moaned as they continued with their actions. Sakura's moans were making Naruto's COC move about a lot more, adding more pleasure to Naruto while his moans also did the same to Sakura's vagina. The pleasure for the pair grew with each passing moment and it was not going to be long before the two of them would finally reach their own respective limits. However, the two of them were able to control themselves as they parted from one another and Sakura was soon making her own moves on Naruto as she began to kiss him once more. The kiss was deep and passionate between the two as Naruto then moved to be on top of Sakura, and it seemed that the pink-haired Kunoichi didn't mind the change in position. Naruto was soon to make his own move as he began to gently play with Sakura's breasts once more, licking, sousing and kissing on them slowly as well while moving his hands over her body, reaching her thighs and her vagina once more. Naruto felt her there and found her vagina and clitoris to be soaking wet. He smiled and then moved between her thighs and began to lick Sakura's vagina once more, making the pink-haired woman blush deeply at the pleasure that he was giving her. Naruto licked up as much of Sakura's juices as he could manage for the time being and as soon as he had his share once more, he then made Sakura sit up and he then asked her to straddle his hips and do what she liked. Sakura was more than quick enough to get the idea and smiled at Naruto. She then lifted her hips and made sure that her vagina was in a good position over Naruto's COC. As soon as she could be sure that she was in the right angle, she then began to lower herself downwards and she moaned out as she felt her vaginal lips being parted by Naruto's COC as she began to lower herself even more, and she naturally moaned out in pleasure that the feeling of being filled by her lover's COC. As soon as she felt Naruto's COC fill her to the very base, she cried out. Oh. Naruto gritted his teeth and relaxed himself as he then began to run his hands once more on Sakura's breasts and nipples, making her moan out more as they kissed one another deeply. This was the very same moment that Sakura began to move her body up and down. She started slowly at first, until the tip of Naruto's COC was the only part of him still there in her vagina and then she drove herself back down to engulf Naruto's COC once more. That was more than enough to make the two of them moan out deeply at the very same time. Yes. The two lovers carried on with their actions as Naruto kissed Sakura as well as play with her breasts along with running his chakra-covered hands on her body as well as using his mouth and tongue, also coated in his chakra, further pleasuring the pink-haired Kunoichi as she responded in kind by using her own chakra to stimulate the pleasure centers in his own body. Sakura continued to move her hips to take Naruto's COC deeply into her vagina but Naruto was not going to be content with just using his mouth, tongue and hands as he began to move his hips as well. He then lay down and allowed Sakura to move on her own pace, making her happy. Sakura then leaned backwards and this angle allowed her to feel Naruto's COC hit her in a more delicious pace and angle as well. Naruto then stopped as he continued to use his hands this time without his tongue and mouth, content for the moment to caress his lover's body as she continued to move on top of him. The moans coming from there were already growing in tone and pitch, showing that the pleasure for them was mounting to even greater heights, just the way they liked it. Harder. It was not going to be very long before the two of them were going to reach their very own limits and when they felt their release, the two of them moved forward and kissed one another deeply, with Sakura leaning over Naruto while he propped himself on one of his elbows while holding Sakura's head with the other hand as they both felt their orgasm as they kissed one another fiercely, naturally making their moans in each other's mouth. Sakura relished the streams of her lover's cum entering her vagina at the very first stream of his cum in her vagina, It was a delicious feeling that grew even more as she felt her inner walls move about while Naruto fired even more of his juices into her vagina, filling her with the thick and hot liquid that she loved to feel in her body. It was somehow making her feel more safe and secure than normal, something that she needed deeply. Naruto felt the very same feeling as he continued to kiss Sakura just as he felt her inner walls milk him for all he was worth. He could also feel her vagina release more of her juices on his COC, a feeling that he couldn't help but find very delicious to his senses as they continued to kiss one another. As soon as they were done, Sakura gently moved away from Naruto and then Naruto took hold of her and Ino as well, lying down and the three of them relaxed after this moment. It would have been longer for them but with them being on a mission, they knew that this was as good as it got for now. Sakura felt sleep finally claim her and she didn't resist as both she and Ino were now fully asleep and instead of having possible nightmares from their previous battles with the alpha werewolf and its mental thralls, they were going to have something else to dream about for quite a while and those said things were going to be very pleasurable ones at that. Later, Naruto looked at the two as both Ino and Sakura were now resting peacefully and he couldn't help but shake his head a bit and smiled as the two of them were also smiling peacefully while sleeping. He hoped that they would be like this for a while until the time came for them to face the alpha werewolf once more and when they did face it and its minions, the two women would be ready for it. It then made him wonder on just what sort of plan would be best to finally end the threat of the creatures once and for all without endangering the people of the village that they were currently in. It had to be a plan that would be workable and could be pulled off quickly without the enemy knowing about it. And they had to do it fast as there was a chance that the creatures would soon be making their own moves from their new lair. As soon as that came into his mind, Naruto's brain began to conjure up a plan. Thanks for listening. In the next part. In the meantime, please leave a review, I would love to hear your feedback. Especially if it helps me improve the overall story.